a fantastic human being who hosts lovely dinners, and you should all be so lucky as to have an opportunity to share a meal with her. But I'm going to read a much less personal bio, but I'll read it briefly. And then we will hand it over to her. Karen is an associate professor of music at the University of St. Thomas. She teaches graduate and undergrad courses in music ed, research, and matters of diversity and equity. Her research focuses on the impact of whiteness in education, diversification of curricula, and anti-bias music education. She's the founder and editor of a new series through GIA Publishing dedicated to the amplification of underrepresented people and music traditions. Karen's goal is to support the journeys of educators in pursuit of a more socially just music education. Please give a muted Zoom round of applause to Karen, and thank you so much for being here with us, Karen. We will hand it over to you with screen sharing privileges and whatever else you need.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hi, everybody. And I'm so glad to be with you today. I really appreciate the invitation to spend a little bit of time with you and to talk about, honestly, my favorite topic, which is teaching, and connected with that, really thinking about actual diversity and how do we create a real diversity, and instead of the extensive talk that we've done about it over the last couple of years. So I am a very informal person, and I'm from the Northeast, where if we have a question, we just ask it. So I encourage you, if you are not from the Northeast or Italian like myself, that you join me in my culture and regional background, which is to just at any time unmute yourself, and please, if you have a comment or an insight or a question, that's a great time to ask it, is when it occurs to you. Or if that's I live in the Midwest now, where that is not the way people behave, if you would prefer to wait until after, we'll leave some time in the later part of our hour together where we can speak freely. Because of the nature of the sort of work that I do and where my research sits, it's often awkward and uncomfortable. And I just want you all to know that I know that, and I'm okay with that. So if we get into some strange, tense air, sometimes people feel badly for their guest, but I want you to know that that's where I want us to go, which is into the place where we're thinking about things, we're questioning paradigms, even in popular music, right? That sometimes we feel, oh, well, we're over there, we've made the jump, but regardless of the canon that we're pulling from, there are things we need to unpack and question, as we are often the person at the helm. So I will probably also feel a little bit of squirm if the topic gets a little tense, but that is the place where growth happens. I prepare myself for that feeling anytime I'm working with people, and I just want you to know I'm okay, and I want you to be okay with that. So let me share my screen and say all the things that people say when they're sharing their screen. I thought about what to put down as a friendly title for what I wanted to talk about with you today. And I put popular in parentheses on purpose, because when we're talking about crafting diverse settings, scenario, representations, repertoire, that's best practice across, regardless of if you're coming from a jazz perspective, the huge umbrella of popular music perspective, if you're more oriented toward Western European classical music, etc. The kinds of things we're talking about related to diversity have to do with all of them. If you're a specialist with children, with adults, with adult children, whoever it may be, it's best practices that really go across, regardless of the sort of music that you present. Hopefully you'll see that there are commonalities across, which is why I put that in parentheses. I just about 24 hours ago returned from a trip to Korea and Vietnam, and which is why I may stumble over my words a little bit just from jet lag. But I often, when I travel, I really like to think about what is happening musically. Food and music, they drive my interest. So I spend some time looking into what are the most popular pop songs with all of the genres that fall under there in Vietnam right now. As I just got home from there, let's see maybe a minute or so of little bits of the top 40 songs right now in Vietnam.
Khi yêu chỉ cần như thế, chia tay có khi làm nên quá vội vã, trở thành điều lấy sự ấm lòng là với em này, người mà đang đứng trước em là danh em, nụ cười mà ta vô tình bỏ lại trên môi người đã biến hóa em từ khi thành lục địa để biến hóa mỗi lần ôm em qua kỳ giây anh nó ok lâu ngày ta mặt trời này trống rỗng chẳng tìm ra chân.
So there's just a little bit of 40 through 35. And there are already so many things we could unpack with each of those examples, right? As far as visual influences, sonic influences, historical influences, and some of them will have nothing to do with what my white outsider perspective is laying on top of that, right? I only have the lens that I have. And part of my personal work is always trying to think about to recognize that lens and try to see around it so that I'm not interpreting this through, well, it must mean this in Vietnamese culture. I was also in Korea, and I thought just, again, I like to have sound. Music is our area, and I don't like to attend a conference where there's no music. So I was also digging around in some different Korean genres. We've all heard of K-pop at this point, V-pop, J-pop, C-pop, right? This craze throughout Eastern Asia that has really spread across the world at this point. But I was looking at the broad category of alt rock in Korea just to get a few sample sounds here. Oh, I forgot to hit forward, sorry. The different slide would help. Sorry, it's doing a very odd thing. Here we go, that's the one I want. There's so much to listen here. Even though I just got home, this is what I've been doing, is digging through all of these recordings. So as I'm listening to these things, I'm really thinking about what are the influences, not just musically, but I'm thinking about what informs musical practices besides sonic things. I'm thinking about language. I'm thinking about colonization. I'm thinking about historical conflict. I'm thinking about language structure. I'm thinking about internet influence. I'm thinking about outward and inward influence. I'm thinking about hybridity, all of these different things that I think about whether I'm thinking genre or specific culture. A lot of my work has to do more on the ethnomusicology side of things, but it's the same application if I'm staying within the popular music umbrella. Here's another example. This is not from my recent trip, but I want to show you how diversity doesn't just mean repertoire. It means background, all of these things I keep repeating. This is a group that one of my graduate students introduced me to, the Tet Seo sisters. They are from Nagaland, which is in the northeastern corner of the country of India. And they have a wonderful YouTube channel, lots of recordings. And I want to show you the work that they're doing, which is their traditional music from their ethnic group and how they are intersecting with popular music styles. So here's a little example of a lullaby. So good. Here is an example of when they take one of their traditional pieces and they create a new version of that. So this isn't the same song, but it's using some of the same isms from that first piece. Same group, same family, same sisters. So the reason I chose to start with all of these examples is to eliminate any perception of a silo of the sort of work that we're doing. So much of my work has to do with quote world music, which I'll unpack in a moment. It's a very problematic phrase that I have to chase around anytime I'm working with people. But that really looking at music as a phenomenon that happens, that is influenced by so many different constructs other than sonic. And sometimes people will think, oh, well, if you work with world music, you're over here. Or if you're an orchestral musician, you're over there. And if you're a Kodai person, you're over here. If you do modern band, you're over here. And I'm really interested in looking at the commonalities rather than separating us further. Let's see if I can make my slides cooperate. I realize there are people from other countries in attendance at this conference when I was looking through the list of papers being presented. And my perspective is certainly as a US music educator. And a lot of what informs my work has to do with what led to the way I was educated to be a music educator, what led to education in general in the US. And much of the things that I'm interested in are often not taught in music ed classes or education classes. They're not found in our textbooks. And I've spent a lot of my career piecing together things to have a better understanding of how the musics that I'm so interested in came to be, and why aren't they represented in more typical curricula. So how did we get here? I won't go through all of these because our time is very short today, but just to say, these are the things we don't learn about in US education courses. To be a teacher in the US, you don't need to know anything about the civil rights movement to pass a licensure test. And yet you will be teaching students in whatever your discipline is directly impacted by the events of the 1920s, 30s, certainly before that as well, but specifically going through all of these critical events that happened that then directly impact education, from civil rights acts that we're still having issues with related to voting and policy, to activism, the role of music in activism, things that have been going on for 50, 60, 70 years that we're still battling with now as we see in our schools. So when people will say, well, times are changing, that's really a white person thing to say. Maybe it's changing for white people's perspectives. But if you are from a community of Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian, immigrant, disability culture, language, whatever that may be, if you're not from the mainstream male white pattern, this is not new to you, right? So that's the other thing I'm trying to put forward is, we're missing chunks of our education. So we send teachers out into the field thinking that the population is changing. And so now it is a good time to change. No, we're quite late. we're late and overdue and all of the words that describe that. The multicultural movement, we still hear this talked about. And I remember when I was a doctoral student, one of my fellow cohort said to me, multiculturalism, didn't we do that? Didn't that happen? And I was so startled to think that somebody would think we ever achieved it. Because the reality is the multicultural movement came out of the civil rights movement, and the goals of it were never met. So what happens in society, in societal movements, they have a goal. It's usually a very worthy goal. and then cracks are found. Okay, we didn't succeed because of this. We weren't addressing that. We need to shift our goals. So I just have a little bulleted list here of some of the things that keep shifting the dialogue when we don't meet the goal of an equitable and socially just music education. So this whole idea of multiculturalism emerged out of social action in the 60s and the 70s. The 70s saw the uprising of the voices of the LGBT community, the elderly community, discussion of disability culture. In the 80s, we started to get a pushback. This is when whiteness studies started to happen. This is when the topics of decolonization really pushed forward in education literature. Some will say, oh, decolonizing music, that's a new topic. No, it's just a thing we do in music education. When we hear about something, we think it was just created. But there are decades and decades of research related to, we're actually in the third wave of whiteness studies and its impact on education. Again, music education, we sometimes follow a little late to the party. In the 80s in music education, we had Barbara Reeder Lundquist, my mentor, Pat Campbell, starting to push this idea of an ethnomusicological perspective in music education, bringing in diverse voices. But as soon as the word diverse comes in, there's a confusion with that language in the mainstream that it must mean everything other than Western classical music. So there's Western classical music and there's diverse music. And what I'm working to clarify is it's all music. When we say diverse music, we mean the music that has been overlooked, underrepresented, oppressed, and we're looking to transform the landscape of music education. So certainly the efforts of APME do that in its efforts. And then I still encourage, as I'll put forward on some of the slides, I still encourage us to think about, and how is the work in popular music education perhaps keeping certain status quos in place? And how might we reflect to see where things can be moved? From this, we saw the adoption of critical pedagogy, a development of critical pedagogy. Of course, I saw several papers on this conference related to critical pedagogy coming out of the work of Paulo Freire, but it took time for that to develop in the US into some sort of philosophy. And it's the Mayday group that is our music education hub for critical pedagogy, where people are chewing on matters of that. And yet, even though we have a professional group dedicated to matters of critical pedagogy, do we in fact reinstill some oppressive practices through our very study? These are things we're checking on. 80s and 90s, we started to get some diverse material, but predominantly on the shoulders of elementary music educators. And I'm sure some of you realize that the secondary band orchestra choir model has held its grasp tightly for the entire history of music ed in the US. And, you know, we're starting to have some movement. Certainly the work of this group is helping to make changes. But if we don't change that undergirding curriculum, how are we going to have professors equipped to teach those classes to prepare teachers to send out, right? We have a shortage across the board there. When we started to find parts of critical pedagogy that weren't getting us where we needed to be, then this name of social justice in education came forward, where we started looking directly at racism, social bias, prejudice, and how it was blocking equity in education. This idea of decolonizing music education, again, quite a few people have been writing about it specifically in our field. Brandy Pace and Lorelei Battislong founded the wonderful Decolonizing the Music Room. But again, it's a many decades long conversation. The idea of, do Black Lives Matter in music, right? Many of our popular music, if not the majority of our popular music traditions in the US, stem directly from Black music traditions. And yet, is that how we honor them in the larger conversation? I live in Minneapolis, and about a mile and a half from what is now called George Floyd Square. And so have really seen a very local conversation about what we need to do in education. But the conversation alone is not getting us anywhere. It's being noisy, being active, and taking steps that encourage people to make change. And that's really what I mean when I talk about matters of diversity in popular music education or music education at large. So I am connected with a new series called World Music Initiative. As I said, it's a very problematic phrase because it implies other, right? Similar to if we say ethnic music, what might come to mind for many people is anything except Western European classical music, Western European opera, Appalachian music. Those likely aren't what come to mind when we hear world ethnic. If you think ethnic food, you probably don't think of apple pie, right? If you're born and raised in the US, and especially if you're white. We use this term ethnic, meaning everything else, which then emphasizes this invisible whiteness that dictates so much of the policy that impacts us and thereby our students. So the mission of World Music Initiative, it's in the front of all of our materials, is to honor that world music is any music by anyone, anywhere, at any time. Yet the focus of our publications is to uplift marginalized and underrepresented musics and associated cultures in music education, as Brian said in that nice introduction, in order to help build the confidence of music educators on their journeys, to really diversify their practices, to diversify their disposition as an educator. The goal of these materials is to collaborate with somebody from a culture who is an expert in many of the local music traditions, but we have also included in all of our materials links to current music practices from the place, historical music practices, what we would call traditional or folk styles, ideas for how to arrange with integrity using these materials, links to contemporary artists, etc. So we're trying to situate these as living cultures instead of museum exhibits. So we have one with my teacher from Ghana, Kwasi Dunyo. Voice collectors is Sarah Watts from Penn State and Le Zheng from Shanghai Normal University, where they interviewed 35 active musicians from different areas in China. Each chapter features a different musician. Harambe is with my teacher and friend Kedman Mapana from Tanzania. And then we have our first choral octavo, which when you open it, instead of seeing notes on the staff, you see a couple of pages of notes about the genre, the history, what the piece is about, videos to look at, YouTube links, contemporary artists, etc. That's our philosophy with everything that we're doing here. For the next little bit, I'd like to talk to you about where all this work has led my research over the last decade or so. This book just came out a couple of months ago, Realizing Diversity and Equity Framework for Music Education. And I use the verb realizing because I've been on every diversity committee everywhere I've ever worked. And honestly, what we've achieved is depressing on a regular day, very upsetting on a bad day, and mildly encouraging when I'm trying to be very positive about it, because often the people on the diversity committee are the people already doing the work of doing equity work. And or if you go to a conference, there might be a strand where all of the diversity and equity workshops happen. And so then who goes to those? All the people you already know. It's not as common to pull people in. So part of our work and part of what I'm advocating for is that every strand should have a required equity component, that it's been recognized, dealt with, chewed on, so that we don't have an entire thread where you can attend a 3-day conference and not engage with matters of diversity and equity. right? I'm hoping we can see conference models change, because again, otherwise I see my same set of friends at every, when we sit and we chat and we all watch each other do our presentations, instead of undergirding and becoming part of the infrastructure of education, right? It's not a side dish. It should be one of the main undergirding ingredients. So in order for this work to come to fruition, I am very grateful to the Southern Poverty Law Center. They are an organization formed during the civil rights in Montgomery, Alabama, and they have 4 branches. Learning for Justice, which is the organization that I collaborated with for this book. It made for teachers, by teachers. Everything on the site is free. And it has to do with matters of immigration, challenges for the LGBT community, matters of identity, language, disability challenges, disability culture, disability studies, etc. I highly recommend it for everybody, regardless of if you're a graduate student, a practicing professor, a K through 12 teacher, a caregiver, whatever you may be, highly recommend it. Southern Poverty Law Center also has Fighting Hate, which it's a map that will show you all the hate groups right near you. I suggest you have a drink candy when you look at it. It's a scary list, but better to be informed about what's right around you. And then there is the Civil Rights Memorial, and then there is their branch that sends legal help for civil rights lawsuits. As identified by Learning for Justice, they have a framework for social justice standards in education. And there are identity standards nested within diversity standards, nested within standards about justice. And the larger picture for all of it, again, hearkening back to Paulo Freire and the idea of critical pedagogy, is leading toward a critical consciousness that moves one to action. And everybody's action looks different. If you think of action as a spectrum, action is anything that goes beyond thinking and reading, right? Any step, any change in your practice, in your discussion, in your pedagogy, in your strategies, in your networking, in your research, in your writing. And they gave me permission to use their framework with some language tweaks to make it applicable for music education. I mean, what I've found is that working in music education for 30 years now, if the word music isn't there, some educators will feel, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me. Maybe it's because we've all had to go to professional development that is about math, right? And we're mad. We're bitter about all those reading sessions we had to sit through. I did too, as a public school teacher all those years. But just putting the word music into a sentence somehow helps people go, oh, I see how this applies to me now. I see how this applies to my guitar ensemble. I see how this can apply in my digital production class. I see how this can apply in my modern band, whatever it may be. Just briefly to show you some of the standards, and I'm going to be going through this very briefly, but I can make these slides available to you after in a PDF. So the main identity standards, anything in bold is the language that I inserted to make it clear that it's about music. So identity standards have to do with developing positive social identities based on our roles in society. Understanding about multiple musical identity groups, recognizing that people's musical identities interact, impact, meet with, clash against in unique ways, expressing pride and preference without denying the value of others. This is something we can probably all work on, myself included. I have my faves. And recognizing traits of the dominant musical culture. I would imagine everybody that is involved in this particular organization already understands that, and it may be part of what drew you into this work. And we need your voices, and we need the work that you're producing and providing. Then what I did within the book is show outcomes. So if you're somebody that either works with young children or prepares teachers to work with young children, or you're researching music education for young children, there are outcomes for lower elementary, upper elementary, middle school, high school, and undergrad students. If you're an undergrad student, please don't take this the wrong way, but I have found there's a lot of similarity between high school students and undergraduate students when it comes to diversity work. They're coming in a similar strata of understanding. What I have particularly stressed in this book that I was never given is outcomes for myself. So if I'm supposed to understand how to craft music education environments that celebrate diversity, how do I do it if I haven't had it modeled for me, or that I don't understand what those expectations are? So there are outcomes for us to consider as well. Meaning, for example, I have a positive view of myself and the music I listen to, and an awareness with my membership in multiple groups. For example, the next one, another outcome for a music educator, I know my family's musical history and cultural background and describe how my own musical identity is informed and shaped, or in my case, not shaped, by my membership in multiple identity groups. Another outcome for music educators, I know that all my artistic, educator, and cultural group identities and the intersection, I can't see the slide, of those identities create unique aspects of who I am, and that is true for other people too. You get the idea of how these are worded. I'll skip ahead to some of the diversity ones. An outcome for music educators, I interact comfortably and respectfully with all people and their music traditions, whether they're similar to or different from me, or different from what I was taught. This can be really hard for those of us that have stayed in education our whole lives. We love a lot of our teachers, and sometimes it's hard to look back and see what was missing. And I am often at odds with my colleagues with the sorts of things I'm saying, particularly my ensemble director colleagues and my studio colleagues, where I'm trying to hold them responsible as well. And somebody will say, I'm a trombone studio professor. What does this have to do with me? And I say, everything. It has everything to do with you, because your trombone students are going to go forth in the world with your model and interact with the world, including students at some point. So there are, you can see one for each standard. There are outcomes, again, K to 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 8, high school and undergrad, and then us as well. I'm going to skip through these, but just so you know, they exist. I will hit the action ones, because the goal of diversity work, it's not just to diversify your repertoire, right? And I hear culturally responsive teaching thrown around a lot without talking about the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings or Geneva Gay. So diversifying repertoire is not culturally responsive teaching. They may share a drink together sometimes, but it doesn't mean they're the same thing, right? They're related. One does not equal the other. And I just keep saying it until my voice wears out, that diversifying your repertoire is one step on a long bridge to get somewhere. So some examples of outcomes we can consider. And again, a lot of these are just suggestions to think about, to chew on. A suggested outcome for myself is I feel and express empathy when people and their musical traditions are excluded or mistreated in music education because of their identities, and concern when I personally experience bias. I take responsibility for standing up to exclusion, prejudice, and injustice in music education through my own and others' music-making practices, and this includes with colleagues and administrators. So even if you're, okay, if you're doing your dissertation, finish that first, right? Don't go toe to toe with your advisor, because they have control of your very soul right now. Once that's done, right? But still being able to speak your mind. You know, before I had tenure, I was the same person saying the same things. And I would say, if I can't work towards these goals, this isn't the right job for me, right? And I fortunately haven't had to leave, but I've had to remind myself that many times. And even a couple of times with my undergrad students, if I have hesitated about something and they would say, well, don't you say that we're supposed to? And I think, oh, I did say that. Yeah, okay. You know, that would come up if they saw something in their student teaching placements or in their field work. And I would say, can we at least talk about how you'll approach this? Right? So I have to put my money where my mouth is, so to speak. I have the courage to speak up to people when their words, actions, or views are biased and hurtful, and I will communicate with respect even when we disagree about music scheduling, about repertoire, about concert practices, about research topics, about how you conduct your research, about what should be published, about who's represented, about the overwhelming number of white male faces on the podium, etc. I stand up to exclusion, prejudice, and discrimination in music education, even when it's not popular or easy, or when no one else does. And I will join with diverse people to plan and carry out collective action against exclusion, prejudice, and discrimination in music ed, and will be thoughtful and creative in our actions to achieve our goals. So in thinking about all of this, well, yes, a place to start would be thinking about how you select your repertoire, right? How you select your research sites, how you select your methodologies, right? Ethical song research, or simply ethical research in our field. Who is expected to do all of this research in order to meet those sorts of standards I was just talking to you about? All of us, including your professors, including your ensemble directors, including your colleagues, even when there are no lyrics present, even if it is instrumental only, there is background to understand the people, the voices, even digital music, unless it's AI, but that's not what I'm talking about today. All musics are connected to the people that created it, that perform it, that celebrate it, that pass it on, all right? So all of us are responsible for that. When we research music, without just ordering a score, ordering the packet, ordering the latest thing, getting a reading, standing in line to get a reading packet. I've done that. I've hurried to the room to make sure I get a copy of the reading packet until I started publishing. And then I understood the racket behind the scenes, which is that those reading packets we're in such a hurry to get are what the publisher wants to sell, unless you're invited to select. But usually people are grateful and they'll say, oh, well, they're providing us with reading packets. They're pushing what they want to sell unless they have music educators in on the selection. And I'm not even mad about that. It's just what it is. So once you know it, then you can start to put different steps in place. When we research our music, lets us treat it as in culture and as culture, which really comes from anthropology, ethnomusicology, instead of sound only. Some people will say, well, I teach music. That's not my job. Well, then whose job is it? Because then the math person can say, but I teach math, but I teach reading, but I teach French, but I teach biology. Then whose job is it? And it allows us to either purchase or create, arrange, compose socially responsible resources. The main reason I've done a lot of research about what is keeping us from doing these things we say we want to do. And it's time. I know, I do know, because I get it. But nobody has time. And yet, how has that worked for us? We're accountable for what we program, every teacher, every discipline. And sometimes what I'll say to people is, depending on what sort of, if you're teaching a college class, look at your syllabus, look at the readings, the recordings, the videos. If you're an ensemble person, look at your programs over the last 3 years, let's say, and just see whose voices did you highlight? What repertoire did you highlight? What languages were represented? What historical eras? Because we all know, I bet everybody on this meeting has a colleague or a fellow student or has heard, when you say, is there historical diversity? They think Baroque, classical, romantic. That's the history they're talking about. I remember a fellow doctoral student saying he had addressed diversity by including Palestrina. And I was so sure he was kidding that I went sitting in the front of the room. I thought that was really funny, but no, he was serious. And, that just solidified in me work to do. There's a lot of work to do. And you're right. Your university training should have prepared you to do this. But how do we do what we haven't seen? How do we do what hasn't been shown to us to be important? And especially if you're white, you can sail through life without having to really think about these things, because what's been presented to you is structured on the invisible presence of whiteness, on a curriculum that is meant, even if you don't mean it, a curriculum that is meant to perpetuate that cycle. Okay, it's already 40 minutes after. So briefly, I am part of the faculty for the World Music Pedagogy courses attached with Smithsonian Folkways. So every summer I teach a certificate course at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul. We spend 40 hours with myself and a team of 8 other teachers from all around the world, and different political movements, cultural movements, styles. We spend an intense 40 hours together, and yet this archive is flawed. It's full of materials that have problematic lyrics, problematic backgrounds, mistakes in the liner notes. Liner notes, if you're of a certain age, my age people grew up reading the liner notes that came out of albums. So, we would know who were the musicians and where did it take place and who. Now, if you stream, we don't even know who was in the band, right? So that's a reality that we just have to deal with. And it means you now have to find the sources. On Folkways, just a little side note, all of the liner notes have been scanned in by interns. So every recording, everything out of the 70,000 sources, the liner notes are available. So I will often come here for some research, but I know that's not all there is. I have to hit it from multiple angles. For example, Wikipedia used to be such a joke that we didn't even go on it. However, scholars would get offended that their area was so misrepresented and started building it up. So I use it as a starting off point. Let's say if I'm doing Haitian music, I'll go here, I'll look up something about Haiti, and within seconds, I'll find several different folk music categories that I need to know about, different popular music genres that I hadn't heard of before, more information here. And now I know where to start looking and where to start digging. We don't really have time to get into matters of cultural appropriation, but it happens in all genres, whether you're a digital musician, whether you are a rap artist, whether you do modern band. The idea of appropriation is prevalent across all matters of all society, everywhere you look. There are ways to avoid it, and one of those ways is really understanding what it is. So I did write a free access article about this. You don't have to be a NAFME member to access it because they thought it was an important topic. How about that? I agree with that decision. In March 2020, there's an article version of this Music Educator Journal through NAFME. Again, you don't have to be a member to access that one. I think if there was one main point that I want to leave with you about what is cultural appropriation in music education, it's taking the intellectual property without permission. How do you get permission? It's not by asking your Black friend or your Ojibwe friend or your Mexican friend, because one person can't speak for an entirety and may not feel comfortable telling you, right? The way you get your permission is through your research, by doing your due diligence to have a good sense about where's that sample from? What influenced this style of playing? It is harmful. This, I think, is the major one. It's harmful when the source community is a minority, I would say minoritized group that has been oppressed or exploited in other ways, or when the object of appropriation is particularly sensitive. So if you're a white music educator and you want to do a Black music genre, there needs to be an awareness that Black culture has been oppressed by white culture, not by you, but by the culture group, the racial group that you belong to. Right? And there needs to simply be some research done to understand, is that a piece you should bring forward, right? Is that something you can take with you with integrity? If you don't feel ready to talk in an informed way with your students of whatever age, or in your research in a responsible way, I would say wait until you are ready, right? If you think, I have a choir and we want to do spirituals, but I'm not comfortable talking about that, I don't know anything about it, don't do that spiritual until you are ready, right? And Learning for Justice, that website that I mentioned, the organization, loaded with materials to help you. That should be an all-day topic, but I just covered it in about 45 seconds. So I am going to pop out of here so that we have a little time to talk about some of these things. Again, just reviewing some of the key points were that really my main takeaway for today would be that diversity should be part of the infrastructure of what we do, not a side topic, not something you cover one night, but something that is embedded in every course by everybody. Instead of, for example, at St. Thomas, for a stretch, the only time the students talked about race or equity or diversity was with me. Fortunately or unfortunately, they had me for 7 classes. That's different now. We've changed that, but that meant they had an opportunity to talk about it. Often what we hear is that students have had one diversity course in their whole college career, right? And then that's reliant on the shoulders of that one person to teach that class in a way that a music educator will take away something meaningful, right? So that's really the main point I'm trying to make, is really considering the canon that we involve ourselves in, thinking about who we are, what lens we are using to view music, and to be relentless. I mean, I think about the theme of this is the future we create, right? The theme of your couple of days together. The future we create is on thin ice if we're not aware and really informed about the past that brought us there. I think it's a wonderful topic, and that future we create should be informed by from whence we've come, so we don't continue to have graduate students saying, why haven't we done what the Tanglewood Declaration said in 1967, right? They say it every year in the sociology seminar. Why haven't we done this yet? That is a just question, right? So hopefully I haven't scared you off with my very forthright way of speaking, but I really, it's my favorite thing to be with educators and to grapple with these topics. So I'd love to open up the floor to hear from you, whether it's questions, if you have an issue with anything. Remember, I'm okay with that. I encourage you to share freely, and you can unmute and ask it that way, or you can put it in the chat. Thank you, Brian. I did see that it was read quite a bit, which is a nice thing to see. That article about cultural appropriation has been.
It's been the most read MEJ article every month since it's come out. They give you the last 6 months of readership, and Karen's is always #1. And those of us who are lower on the list are okay with that because it's required reading.
Well, and I think that's very telling. #1, they made it open access. So that says a lot about access, right? Maybe more people would read things if they didn't have to pay so much money to have access to the journals, right? We're already a very elite sort of field. We already keep people at bay because of the cost of being part of what we do, right? And then we make our journals too expensive. You know, and I have a back and forth with NAFME. I'm still talking. I said I was going to open it up. I have a love-hate thing there. It's a necessary thing. I don't know. And hi, Kim. I see Kim on here. I know Kim from Canada and is using that for a book club. That's fantastic. Oh my goodness. And please know, I really mean this. I say this all the time, and I think people don't believe me, but this work is hard to do alone. And it really does drive me so deeply. And so please use me as a resource. You know, if you can't bring me to you in person, call me. Let's have a Zoom. Let's talk. Let me support you in any way that I can. This is hard stuff. I'm just used to it now. I've been doing it long enough that I don't quake in the presence of it. And I'm okay with all of the mistakes that I've made. I can look back, and I can even keep doing this. Even, you know, a couple of years ago, some people I don't know came at me in a really nasty fashion online, and it almost scared me off of the work, almost. And I thought, and I thought, if I give up, then That's one less person being the squeaky wheel. And that's the whole point is, and I have a very good therapist who said, oh, you want to do this work and you can't take a little heat? I said, oh, I hear that. Yeah.